Welcome to the China-MENA podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Fulton, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a political scientist at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. Over the course of this season, we've looked at China's growing role in the Middle East from a range of perspectives, but the U.S.-China relationship has never been far from the surface. Essentially, on nearly every issue we've discussed, competition between Washington and Beijing has been the baseline. To give us a U.S. perspective on China and the Middle East, I'm happy to be joined today by Dana Stroul. Dana is Director of Research and Shelley and Michael Casson Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Prior to that, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, the Pentagon's top civilian official with responsibility for the region. She's served in multiple other roles in the U.S. government focusing on Middle Eastern affairs. Dana, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me today.
It's a pleasure. I'm glad you could do this. I know you've probably been really, really busy for the past, decades. So I'm glad you could get us in today. So here in the Gulf, we often hear that the U.S. has kind of refocused on the Middle East during maybe the second half of the Biden administration. And a lot of folks in the region say that, it's more about competing with China than it is a reflection of America's interests in the region itself. Do you think that's an accurate assessment of how U.S. leadership sees the Middle East?
Well, what I'd like to do in answering that question is start with the big picture about the foundational and publicly available documents that the Biden administration put out in the first 2 years of his presidency to articulate what they said about the challenge of China, which in the Department of Defense, where I just came from after 3 years of service, they spoke about China as the pacing challenge. So first of all, in the Biden administration's national security strategy, they talk about China as the only competitor with both the intent to shape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. And then the national security strategy goes on to say that Beijing is using its technological capacity and increasing influence over international institutions to create more permissive conditions for its own authoritarian model, so its own model of governance, and to mold global technology use and norms to favor or privilege Chinese interests and values. And then after the national security strategy came out, the Pentagon put out its national defense strategy. And there it talks about increasingly coercive actions taken by China that are intended to reshape the broader international system to, again, this theme of fitting its authoritarian preferences. And then it talks about all of the ways in which China is both running massive trade surpluses, which have an impact on U.S. national security, and also China's domination of critical markets, where it can control commodity pricing and access to materials in strategically critical areas that could erode the health of heavy industries that the U.S. defense sector historically relied upon. So that's the big picture. And when it comes to the Middle East, the United States obviously has a very long history of involvement in the Middle East. And the Biden administration defined its objectives in the Middle East broadly as four. One is countering Iran's destabilizing actions. That's both with respect to its illicit nuclear weapons program, its support for terrorism, then countering violent extremism. And I would recall for your listening audience here that there are still thousands of U.S. forces on the ground in Iraq and Syria, making sure that ISIS or Daesh can't return to the region. Also, freedom of navigation and the free flow of commerce, which is obviously a pretty pressing issue at this moment in time. And then ensuring that Israel has what it needs to defend itself. And this was long before October 7th. And then the final reference point for how this administration sees the Middle East, a really good document to look at, is when President Biden visited Jeddah in the summer of 2022. And his team put out a fact sheet, and they described the Middle East as the trade and technology crossroads between two hemispheres. And what the Biden administration and what that trip really laid out was that the Middle East is not viewed by Washington as important only for the Middle East, but on a global scale. And I think particularly when it comes to governments and leaders in the Gulf, they don't see themselves only as regional leaders. They see themselves as global leaders. And the Biden administration acknowledges that very much, and so has sought to both cooperate where possible and warn of certain areas of engagement with Beijing that could threaten what I just laid out at the beginning, the ways in which China is investing in technology, economic influence, and other areas of the military industrial complex that actually are not neutral. It's about projecting China's own model of authoritarian governance globally.
That's a really great overview. I see this a lot just in the region from talking to folks, whether it's from here in the UAE or in other Gulf countries or in the Levant, just this sense that they weren't sure. I think everything you said is a message that they've been receiving, that China's seen as problematic, but it's often been, especially in the technological domains that you mentioned, where the red line has been pretty uncertain, where they'd say, what is it that we can do? Because it's pretty hard to separate, trade relations with China from technological cooperation. And especially when you look at countries' development agendas and trying to move away from certain types of economies to become more modern. And I think what we've seen, at least here in the Emirates and possibly in Saudi as well, that red line might be a little more clear right now when we've seen the G42 Microsoft announcement in December, and then the investment that was announced in February. I think about 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago, recording May 29th, there was the announcement from the Saudi AI giant that if the U.S. made it clear that America wanted this company to divest itself of Chinese AI, it would. Do you think, does this represent kind of a broader consensus in the Middle East that the U.S. approach to the region is more satisfying, it's working, or is it just a preference for the tech that the U.S. has to offer?
Well, let me start by responding to some of what you laid out. I think that, and something we really tried to address in the beginning years of the Biden administration, especially in the Middle East, is a misunderstanding of what the United States was seeking, which was not a divorce from China. There was recognition that every country, China is absolutely an important world power with a very relevant and significant economy, significant trade interests of many countries. The United States has a significant commercial and trade relationship with China, and we are not asking our strategic partners in the Middle East, and in particularly in the Gulf, to separate from Beijing. So a lot of what the engagement has been is to try to clarify exactly where that ambiguity is that you laid out. And here's the issue, I think, for the Middle East that makes how we address these issues different from other parts of the world. The U.S. military and defense relationships in the Middle East are so deep and so historic. We have 5 air bases with over 30,000 U.S. forces across the Middle East. Countries in the Middle East are the most significant purchasers of U.S. origin defense equipment. And clearly there's defense technological and technical exchanges going on all the time. There's also pretty extensive information sharing, intelligence cooperation, all of this. Knowing what China sees as its role going forward, which frankly isn't benevolent, and I think this is where there's been a lot of discussion between governments and leaders in the Middle East and Washington, is that we have to protect these relationships. These are strategic partnerships that are relevant to the United States, enduring for the United States, and we want them to be enduring and important for our partners in the Middle East, which means we have to protect them. And so what has been happening over the past several years is discrete engagement with partners on specific issues where there have been concerns that deepening cooperation with China in a specific area puts at risk the U.S. partnership. And that G42 issue that you referenced, I think, is a perfect example of this. So what we've seen is that the United States has had some concerns about G42's relationship with China. The Microsoft agreement with G42 is a significant demonstration of mutual intent, both by the government in Abu Dhabi and the government in Washington. And then I think also commitment to work with the private sectors as well, to guard both defense technology and how we move forward in AI together, by frankly and proactively addressing where we have very specific concerns. And then one other thing about G42 and Microsoft, it's not just about what the two countries do together bilaterally or what the two companies do together bilaterally. We just saw the implications and the potential on a global scale, which was last week when the Kenyan president, Dr. William Ruto, visited here in Washington, D.C., and there was actually an announcement between the U.S., the UAE, G42, and Microsoft for more cloud computing data centers, et cetera, in Kenya. So it shows that this cooperation isn't just bilateral, but has these global implications to support other countries in their development goals as well. So what I think the hope here in Washington is that this is a model for future cooperation. And let me add on the Saudi point, since you raised that, if you go back and look at that Jeddah communique from 2022, there's all sorts of examples of cooperation between the United States and its partners in the Middle East far beyond the Middle East. A great example is the 5G, 6G Open RAN cooperation that's in the Jeddah communique. Another one is a global infrastructure initiative. All of this is not just about the Middle East and what can be achieved bilaterally, but what cooperation together can productively affect on a global scale.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that I think is really important. You know, the 5G and the G42 Microsoft, I think is going to be really one of those pivotal moments that we look back on in a few years and say that was a really big moment. You know, I've been watching China in this region for quite a while, and you could see there was just so much momentum, at least narrative momentum, about Belt and Road. And you could see things like the Build Back Better and Blue Dot and all of these things that were kind of seen as U.S. and like-minded countries playing China's game or trying to play China's game and not really doing it well. And this, I think, is hitting that sweet spot where I've talked to so many folks here in the Gulf where they'd say, look, we need support in developing, these new economies. We need to find new jobs for our young people. We need industries that aren't based on old models. And really, whichever extra regional power that has the tech capacity, the political willpower, the financial capacity to help us with that, that's going to be a really important partner. And I think what we've seen is, through this deal, this looks like a model to me of what we can expect in the future.
I completely agree with you. And here I would say the U.S. has raised its concerns with respect to certain areas of cooperation that governments or private sectors of our partners in the Middle East are contemplating with Beijing. But it also will require the United States to work with our own private sector, because often our solutions are where we're competing are too slow, too expensive, and there is a need to develop fast and make sure that there are jobs and opportunities for this huge swath of the population of the Middle East, which is young and hungry and interested and globally engaged. So I think this example of the U.S. UAE collaboration with respect to Kenya, I hope it's a model and that there will be more creative thinking about how we can cooperate together, and that this isn't just about competing with China. This is about proactive engagement with the global South, with developing economies, which really is a mutually beneficial for all parties involved.
Maybe going off into the weeds a little bit, but I was in Cairo, I guess, in late 22, and we were talking about China's involvement in ports and infrastructure in the new capital city region, and basically across a range of things. I didn't get the sense that anybody had blinders on. They knew that this was a very transactional, interest-based set of deals with China. But at the same time, there was real concern that how do you get private companies to come into the Egyptian economy and invest in the stuff that's important, because there's always so many concerns from the private sector about issues like corruption or, are we going to actually profit when we go into this? Any idea how you can, to speak to that when you're talking to non-governmental organizations to come into more commercial entities to engage in some of these less wealthy countries?
So first of all, I would say with respect to Egypt, I think for countries that are eager for development, infrastructure support, developing their telecommunication systems, there's a view that U.S. engagement comes with strings attached and conditionality, and China does not. And I think that actually misses the point. I think that upfront, deals with China look more cost effective, faster, and no strings attached. It's just that the strings come later. So whether that means pressure on how a government votes and engages in the United Nations or other international fora, what debt traps and commitments look like, which then steers other decisions that limit opportunities for diversification in economic trade and commercial deals. There are always strings attached because this isn't benevolent. So number one, the United States has tried to address some of this with new kinds of financing bodies like our Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, which is meant to be more nimble, to be able to compete and give our strategic partners like Egypt opportunities and alternatives. And number two, here again, UAE is actually a really good example because the UAE has been quite proactive in engaging with Egypt, and it's not just a loan or a grant to the central government and the central bank. It's real estate development, commercial projects which will create jobs in Egypt. So here again, and with a lot of the ports and the infrastructure desires of partners, and this is not even unique to Egypt, across North Africa, again, I think Washington is increasingly thinking through how it can partner and collaborate with Gulf governments who are also eager to make these investments and be more engaged beyond the sub-region of the Gulf.
Yeah, this to me is really interesting because one of the kind of tropes you keep hearing is China comes into the region and it's an economic actor, and the U.S. is already here as a security actor, and this is just the way people tend to frame it, and I find that really, I mean, wrong. Obviously, I think the U.S. maybe hasn't done the best job of showing people what it does across, economic development, aid, whatever. Just how central the U.S. is. I was at an event earlier today here in Abu Dhabi and talking with folks from different like-minded governments. And one of the issues that came up is, how do we promote a narrative of what we're doing and make sure it gets amplified? And I was thinking, for Gulf countries and other countries in the region that are so focused on development, so focused on new jobs, on investment, when you look at China's trade and you see these big numbers, it's a top trade partner of everybody, but often that trade is really undermining the economies, right? Like China sells a lot of goods to countries, and it undermines their domestic industry. And then in other countries, they buy a lot of stuff, a lot of oil, which makes it harder to divest themselves of that. And so trade and services becomes really important. And I think that's something that really has to be promoted, is what countries like the US or Canada or the Europeans do that help in kind of going away from this model that has really been seen as hamstringing a lot of local countries.
I agree with you. And I would say another aspect of this where I think the US and other like-minded allies and partners have a competitive advantage, frankly, is our system of oversight and our transparency. So when you sign a contract with the United States or the private sector, there are expectations and legal obligations for sunshine and transparency. The contract is going to be in Arabic, not only in English, as opposed to what I understand a lot of Chinese contracts are only in Mandarin. And then come and either the spare parts aren't there, whatever's delivered is broken. It's hard to do maintenance. The U.S. private sector and commercial engagements come with a whole suite of support and engagement, which I think is really important. And I would agree with you. I don't think the United States always does the best job of promoting the ways in which it is value added. It's contributed to regional stability and security, which is obviously in some ways a challenging argument to make at this point in time.
Yeah.
But overall, what the United States has sought to do is support regional security and stability so that there are more opportunities for economic growth. And that is to the benefit of the region, the governments, And frankly, given the deep and extensive network of allies and partners the United States has globally, the idea is to work to integrate all of our partners and allies together across the diplomatic space, the information space, the military space, and the economic space. And ultimately, that creates opportunities.
Yeah, it's a point I never get tired of making because, again, looking at this narrative of, China's the number one trade partner for a lot of countries in the region, when you look at numbers 2, 3, 4, and on, a lot of them are countries like India, Japan, Korea, countries that are U.S. allies or partners that have very similar views of what global governance and international order should look like. And I think a lot of local governments would be more susceptible to that or are more aligned with that as well. So obviously, it's really hard to get different agencies within a government to cooperate on anything, let alone across multiple governments. But I think if you look at it this way to say, look, here's a broad coalition of states that have deep interests in your region's stability and prosperity. And, we're willing to cooperate with you on things. IMEC is a great example of this, or I2U2, or any number of issues where you could say, look, we're coming. It's not us heavy-handed saying this is what we want from you. It's a bunch of countries saying we've looked at this as well. We've got experience we can share and help and maybe contribute to your development.
I agree. I think that first of all, I think at this moment in time, it can be challenging to talk about the rules-based international order because the view is pick which rules-based international order benefits you. So the United States has frequently talked about, with respect to China and also with Russia, this challenge to the rules-based international order. But I think there are many audiences in the region and many governments in the region, and frankly, this is not unique to the Middle East, who look at this and say, no, that benefits the United States. That's your choice for a rules-based international order. So my response to that is that post-World War II consensus about the structure of global engagement, both from a military and security and defense perspective, but also trade, commerce, economy, et cetera, and diplomacy, has benefited the Middle East. Just take a look at these thriving economies and all of the exciting growth that's happening in the Gulf. That is on the foundation of the post-World War II rules-based international order. And at the most basic level, if one country, and here I'm talking about Russia, believes that those rules can be unilaterally changed, or the boundaries of an internationally recognized country can be unilaterally changed with force, everybody loses. And the challenge, if that aggression isn't stopped in Europe, is how will Iran view that in the Middle East? And then how will China view that in the Asia Pacific region? And here, I think there's a tendency to look at what the U.S. talks about with its concerns with respect to Taiwan, as that's in the Asia Pacific region, that doesn't affect us. But the implications for international shipping, free flow of energy, commerce, etc., if there is a war in Asia Pacific and and Beijing decides to try to take Taiwan, the economic and trade implications for U.S. partners in the Middle East are vast, deep, and serious, which is another reason to continue to invest in the current rules-based international order and seek to cooperate where possible.
Yeah, absolutely. The last episode we did was with Hassan al-Hassan, who's at IISS in Manama. And we talked about that. Why aren't Gulf countries thinking more strategically about the Indo-Pacific and how, the Taiwan Straits issue could impact local interests? And I think that's something that's, in a region like this, where everywhere you look, there's something, causing immediate distress. It's really hard to devote precious resources or energy to focus on, something happened thousands of kilometers away. But you're right. It certainly is something that's going to impact here. I think the way you answer that put this on a tee perfectly because, like I said, today's May 29th. Tomorrow is the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum in Beijing. President al-Sisi, President Mohammed bin Zayed, the King of Bahrain, the President of Tunisia. Basically, a lot of very serious Middle Eastern leaders or Arab leaders are in Beijing right now. And the way that the discussions are going to be led tomorrow are China's leadership in the global south, which, is problematic on any number of ways, how it's defined and, does anybody get to self-nominate, as this position? But a lot of it is going to be based on, the hypocrisy of the rules-based order and how countries of the global south should unite. And of course, front and center for how this is being delivered in the agenda tomorrow is Gaza. That's going to be a big part of the agenda and what China's talking about. And they said, the goal is to come up with a common voice with the Arab League states to address this issue. I think China's response has really seemed opportunistic in a lot of ways, but it is taking advantage of that kind of narrative space at a time when, like you said, it's problematic in a lot of ways to talk about a rules-based order in the Middle East right now. How is China's response to the Hamas attack on Israel and its subsequent messaging to Arab publics and governments affected thinking in Washington about China's regional presence? Does it seem more of a challenge? Does it seem very transactional? Does it create space for you to say, look, China's talking a lot, but really not delivering much beyond rhetoric? Or are people even really looking at China very much in this way?
So I think it confirms what Washington already thought about China's role in the Middle East, which is that China is quite content to be pursuing economic, trade, commercial relationships. It will play with diplomacy when it benefits China, but in terms of investing in significant or meaningful arrangements that de-escalate conflicts or promote stability and security, it's words. It's not action. So China hosted different factions of Palestinian leadership, Fatah and Hamas, recently. That was a nice photo op. Nothing came out of it. I would note here that Russia also hosted delegations of Palestinian parties. So I think from the Washington point of view, this confirms that China and that Beijing will seek opportunities where possible to erode or undermine U.S. Leadership and diplomacy in the Middle East. But we haven't really seen anything come of it. Another really good example here is the Yemen-based Houthis, who have since October 7th launched a very significant campaign of attack drones, undersea drones, anti-ship ballistic missiles that have essentially redirected international shipping around Africa rather than through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. This is seriously affecting the economies of Egypt. It's jeopardized Saudi shipping. And given the geostrategic importance of the Middle East as this crossroads for the world, private industry and international shipping picked a different way. In all of this, the United States has sought to organize allies and partners both in a monitoring and presence mission in the Red Sea called Operation Prosperity Guardian, but then also organize some very precise military strikes to try to degrade Houthi infrastructure and capabilities in Yemen that's launching these missiles and drones. China's nowhere to be seen. And to me, this isn't about the United States. This is about upholding and defending part of the rules-based international order, which is freedom of navigation and the free flow of commerce. And this would seem, I think, from a Washington perspective, to be in every government, in every country's objective self-interest, which is to work together to uphold that most basic of principles. And here we have partnership and participation from the Middle East. We also have it from Europe, but not from China. So this is another example, I think, which confirms what Washington has already viewed about China's role in the Middle East, which is a lot of talk, but not seriously contributing to de-escalation.
Well, I think there's 2 points in that. And I think one is that the Middle East on its own isn't really that important to China. The same logic I just mentioned of Gulf states, more immediate priorities, I think that carries to China. When you look at the huge number of countries it shares land and maritime borders with, so many of them are weaker, fragile states or hostile states or U.S. allies. And China's really going to spend most of its time thinking about its immediate periphery. I think when they look at the Middle East, it's a place either to make money or to score points, but it's not a place to really, play a meaningful role. And to me, that I guess the other thing I was thinking about in your answer there was, I think a lot of folks in the region didn't really see it that way. You know, when you'd see the Belt and Road and all of these big MOUs and big contracts and contracting and Chinese expat labor flows and you know, all of this, China, for a lot of folks, it just kind of appeared out of nowhere in this region. And I think a lot of people saw it as a possible answer to some of the challenges facing regional governments. And just talking to people on the periphery of a lot of conversations in regional capitals, China's non-response to the Houthi attacks was really problematic, really eye-opening to say, hey, we expect more from our biggest trading partner. We expect more from a global power. For you to kind of say, hey, they're not hitting us, so we're not going to get involved. I think maybe that changed the way folks in the region thought about China too.
I hope so. And that, again, doesn't mean that there shouldn't be relationships between Beijing and the capitals of the Middle East. But just like between Washington and capitals of the Middle East, it's not all rainbows all the time. We have disagreements and we're very frank with each other. I hope that's some of the messaging that Arab leaders bring to the summit in Beijing this week. And one other point on Gaza. I think at some point, Palestinian leadership in a way that is acceptable to the Middle East is going to be critical. And I think it's very important for Chinese leaders in the summit this week to hear from leaders in the Middle East about how problematic Hamas is as a terrorist organization who has been receiving support for years from Iran. And it's Iran that has increasingly transferred sophisticated weapons, money, funding, training to non-state actors across the region, which contributes to instability and insecurity. And here, there's a really important and economically relevant China-Iran relationship. And what leaders in the Middle East want is stability and security so that they can focus on global leadership, economic prosperity, etc. And Iranian actions, frankly, are gonna push them away from those goals. So I hope that, just having a summit is not going to be viewed in Washington as negative or a win for Beijing and a loss for the United States. But it is an important forum for Chinese leaders to hear about priorities from the Arab world. And one of those, even if there are very serious, important, and real disagreements about the humanitarian situation in Gaza or the level of civilian casualties in Gaza, which are incredibly problematic, I haven't heard one government in the region say they don't want Hamas to be defeated and dismantled.
Yeah.
And that's going to require cooperation.
So this is interesting because I think from the way you're describing this as, kind of a closet optimist, I'm hearing you talking about how if these leaders from the region can go to Beijing and successfully convey this message and Beijing's receptive, do you think that there's space? I mean, given your job in DoD for the past few years, is there space for China to play a positive role? And do you think that's likely? Do you think China could come into the region and support a regional order that's kind of firming up right now? I mean, from 2011 until not long ago, I thought there was no order. It just seemed like absolute, chaos in a lot of ways. But you can see things firming up right now. And I think extra-regional powers have that moment of decision, right? What role are we going to play in this? Do you see a potential for China to be kind of a status quo supporter here?
I think that if there were serious policy changes in how China shapes its role in the Middle East and globally, certainly. Broadly speaking, the policy from Washington has not been completely combative or focused only on competition with China. It has sought to find areas for cooperation where possible. So good examples of that are climate change, renewable energy, these sorts of big issues. Look, these are all big issues for the Middle East. So sure, one issue right now that I would say is really strategically significant for the security of the Middle East is the Iranian supply of weapons and attack drones to Russia, which is being used to kill Ukrainian civilians destroy Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and in particular energy infrastructure. And we've actually seen Iran borrow from the Russia playbook, which was the direct state-on-state attack against Israel in mid-April, where there was a combination of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and attack drones. But even before the April 13th attack, we've seen Iran launch attacks that basically are trying to take energy infrastructure off the grid in the Middle East. And a good example of that are the missile attacks on the Kurdistan regional government and area in northern Iraq. So here I would say if you're a leader in the Middle East, you actually have an interest in making sure that that deepening Russian-Iranian military cooperation, which right now is mostly killing Ukrainian civilians, but we just saw a demonstration of it in the Middle East. You don't want to see more demonstrations of that. And right now, China is both facilitating keeping Russian defense industry alive, which is something that Secretary of State Tony Blinken talked about during his visit a few weeks ago. And there's also a very significant China-Iran relationship. So these are issues where if Beijing were to view itself as wanting to contribute to regional security and stability, I would hope the message they would hear from Arab leaders this week in Beijing is to call Tehran and tell it to stop. And another area where China could make a difference is if it chose to invest in humanitarian aid and assistance, which right now the United States actually remains the regional leader when it comes to Palestinians in Gaza. So
I
there are
remember. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I remember when this China-Arab States Cooperation Forum had its meeting in 2018, the big banner headline was China gives $23 billion to the Middle East. But then when you broke that $23 billion down, something like 21 billion of it was loans, and I think 700 million or so was aid. So not really stepping up.
And again, there's the splashy headlines, which really work for Beijing, and you always have to peek under the lid and figure out the details. There are always strings attached. There are always conditions. It's just whether it's up front or down the line.
So you're mentioning Iran, and that was something I wanted to try to fit in before we wrap up here. If Arab leaders tomorrow talk to Chinese leaders and say, call Tehran and tell them to stop, and if China were receptive to that message and China said, you know what, our economic interests in the region are undermined by Iran's actions, so we should get them to stop, would Tehran listen? Because I have a theory that, China has a lot of material incentives to offer, but it doesn't have much to offer beyond that. And there are times when Iran is receptive to material incentives, but I don't think this is one of them. I think what Iran wants right now, I think they look at the situation in the Middle East as existential. And I don't know if China's saying, we'll give you loans and we'll give you infrastructure and we'll give you investment. I don't think if that's going to really translate to much. So do you think that China actually has that kind of leverage with Iran in their bilateral right now?
So first of all, I would say looking back historically, Iranian behavior has changed when the regime in Tehran has perceived itself to be isolated. And China has demonstrated that it can work cooperatively on issues related to Iran. So the best and most recent example is the Iran nuclear agreement that was negotiated by the Obama administration, which involved European capitals, the United States, also Moscow, and also Beijing. So one of the challenges now, as Iran creeps closer and closer to enough weapons-grade uranium for multiple nuclear weapons, is that Russia and China aren't showing up as interested in working within that multilateral construct to put pressure on Iran. So I think that if the regime in Tehran all of a sudden perceived there to be distance and concern from Beijing, you might actually see some changes. And secondly, China right now is Iran's economic lifeline. It's the reason why the U.S.-led sanctions regime on Iran for its illicit nuclear weapons program, for its support for terrorism, for its use of cyber capabilities to attack and undermine other countries all over the world. The reason why a lot of these sanctions are not as potent as effective as they could be is because the Iranians have been able to sell their oil at a discounted price to China. And they have worked out a system between Iran and Russia where there have been an exchange of best practices and lessons learned for illicit shipments of oil on the high seas from ship to ship, gets to smaller refineries in China. Payments are in Chinese denominated currency rather than US dollar denominated currency. All of this relieves pressure on Iran to make any of the changes that ostensibly most of the world would want, which is not to have a radical regime in Tehran enabled by a nuclear weapon. So I think if the Iranians perceive that the Chinese were no longer going to help them evade sanctions, were no longer going to continue to purchase their oil at discounted prices, or were ready to act in alignment with the United States and European capitals at the IAEA, at the UN Security Council, that would make a difference.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, that there's so much in that, but I think we're already kind of hitting the point. I could do this all day, but you're really busy, and I actually have to get to my kid's school because tonight is sports night, and my son thinks he's going to get the MVP for basketball.
Very important.
It's very important. But Dana, thanks so much for this. This is really, really. I could listen all day for sure. I think our listeners are going to take a lot away from this. There's so much more to discuss about this. Hopefully, now that maybe your schedule's a little less hectic, you probably have a little more time to talk about this, so rather than put out fires all the time. It'd be great to continue this conversation later on, maybe in Washington or here in the Emirates. To our listeners, thanks for joining us. This is the last show for a while. This wraps up season 2. We're going on hiatus for a little bit, but a little shameless self-promotion. I've started a newsletter on Substack. It's called very creatively the China-MENA newsletter, and I've been trying to update pretty frequently. So it's a place if you need more China, Middle East, news. Go to Substack, subscribe, and check it out.
And I will just say that I am a subscriber. I find it incredibly helpful, as are many people here at the Washington Institute and across Washington. So thank you, Jonathan, for putting it together. There's a bunch of avid readers here.
Awesome. Thanks. That's great to hear. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. We'll see you all soon.